And good afternoon. My name is Larrie Ferreiro, and I'm going to be talking this evening about the Allied innovations that mastered the air. And you can see the reference to the current series that is streaming on Apple TV based on the book of the same name, Masters of the Air, which is about the strategic bombing campaign during World War II. And it's focused on the American side of the combined Allied campaign. It's also, this presentation is based on the book that you see on the left, came out a couple of years ago, and it's called Churchill's American Arsenal, the partnerships behind the innovations that won World War II. And right away, you can see two of the elements that I'm going to be talking about this evening. On the left, that is, of course, Winston Churchill, but he's in front of a P-51 Mustang. And even though the majority of um, uh, 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 aviation aficionados would think of the P-51 as an American plane, as I'll explain. It had its roots deeply embedded in Britain's Royal Air Force, the RAF. On the right, of course, is one of the stars of the television series Masters of the Air, and that's the B-17 Flying Fortress bomber with the flight crew walking in front of it. What is most interesting about these stories is that the uh, technologies that allowed this kind of campaign to take place were not developed independently on each side of the ocean, one by Britain and one by the United States, but instead was the result of a very strong combined effort by the scientists and engineers and workers in both countries to make these innovations come to life. And most importantly, the innovations that allowed the bombing campaign, not the bombing campaign of both on the American side with the B-17 and the British side with the Lancasters and other aircraft, of course, to happen, those innovations were developed as the war was being fought. So let me be clear, I'm not going to be talking about the bombers themselves. Those had long been in development, but the radar and other navigation systems that allowed them to reach their targets, those were the innovations that I'll be talking about that, as the title of this presentation says, allowed the Allies to master the air. And it's important to understand that World War II was one of the uh, first wars where industry was brought to bear on the question of creating and maintaining a fighting force, even as the war was raging. Uh, Before the Second World War, uh, uh, the campaigns on land in World War II, World War One, uh, occasionally in the air, and of course at sea, those certainly had some industrial elements, but in all countries, industry and science was fully turned to the question of how to defeat the adversary. And this was true in all nations, but it was especially true among the Allied nations, in particular, Britain and the United States. And because of its reliance on these new weapons and new inventions, many historians have named various innovations as the ones that brought victory. Airborne radar and P-51 Mustang are two that I'm going to be talking about, but you can give equal credit to the development of the antibiotic penicillin, which cut down dramatically on mortality. the Liberty ship, which brought supplies across the Atlantic, landing ships, and of course the atomic bomb. The thing to understand is that any one of these weapons and inventions might have been key to uh, Allied victory. What all of them had in common was that they were a result of a very close partnership between Britain and the United States. And that partnership at the scientific and technological level happened while the war was being engaged. For those of you who have seen the movie Oppenheimer, you might be excused for missing the 2-second clip where what you should understand is that started by Winston Churchill, and only when the British understanding of nuclear fission and the potential of a bomb was revealed to the Americans did the Manhattan Project come into being. And in fact, that project had enormous British participation right from the start. So here, I'm just going to be talking about a couple of things that represent that much wider collaboration between the two countries and focus on these innovations that helped to win the war in the air. Now, you've often heard the phrase a special relationship between the United States and Britain, except that wasn't the case for much of the time prior to World War II. The United States and Britain, although were not exactly allies, were not at war. We'd been at war several times, but we weren't in that era, the United States and Britain, particularly friendly. There was a lot of bad blood having to do with the First World War, finances, reparations, and Britain itself was convinced that when war came around the second time with Germany, that it could rely on its most important relationship, its most important ally, and that ally was not the United States, it was France. France and Britain together had defeated Germany during the First World War. The Americans and other nations, of course, helped out quite a bit, but they were the prime. They were the primary combatants who carried out the defeat of Germany. So Britain's entire war plan was based on a very strong alliance with France. On paper, they were absolutely better than Germany. There were the two allies together had more troops, more planes, more tanks, better tanks in many cases. And it all fell apart in May and June 1940 because what seemed to be strength on paper turned out to be weakness in real life. And we shouldn't hold Britain and France to blame. Every army that encountered the Nazi war machine was badly defeated at first. Not just Britain, not just France, but also the Soviet Union and also the United States. The doctrine, the tactics, the strategies simply overwhelmed their adversaries. And so by June 1940, France was out of the picture and Britain had been knocked back on its heels. It wasn't until the dust had cleared and it became evident that Britain needed another ally, another special relationship that wasn't France, that this famous special relationship, as you see between Churchill and Roosevelt, really came into being. And the event that brought this special relationship into being was Dunkirk. So there's another movie that I can refer you to. What happened at Dunkirk, of course, was that the um, the British and other Allied troops, especially French, were cornered into this one pocket at the coastline and surrounded by German Nazi vehicles, tanks, and other weapons, and needed to evacuate all of its personnel across the channel to back to the UK. And they did this. A surprising number were, the vast majority, in fact, made it to relative safety in England. And that wasn't just British troops, it was also French and other Allied troops. The problem was that almost every piece of equipment that these troops had was left in the beaches and the countryside around Dunkirk. 10,000 tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, everything. So not only did the British troops not have the equipment that they would need to retake the continent, now that France was out of the picture, they didn't have that strong ally that they could rely on. So they had to start rebuilding their army and air force almost from scratch. But they were simultaneously under attack from German bombers. The factories themselves were working night and day to produce enough aircraft and engines and other equipment. They were busy repairing damaged equipment, and they were being bombed on an almost nightly basis. And so the factories themselves were spread out to unlikely places like people's garages and hospitals in order to keep up production. But there never was going to be enough um, uh, capability, industrial capability, to rebuild the Army and the Air Force and the Navy, and then build and then continue to build enough so that a new force could take the continent, land, move across, and then take the fight all the way to Germany. For that, they needed to turn their eyes to the Americans. But it wasn't simply building the items that they already had on the drawing boards. That was something the Americans could do, but there was much more that could be accomplished, and that was to make use of the scientific innovations that Britain had been developing over the past 10 years when it knew it was eventually going to fight Germany. It had been rebuilding its technology base since the early 1930s, and then was fighting Germany in real time for 2 years. And what Britain did was send a mission in September and October of 1940 called the Tizard Mission in order to entice the Americans to participate in developing these new weapons and inventions. Now, keep in mind, the United States was neutral at this point. And there's probably no better way of explaining the difference between the British mentality and the American mentality than to show you these two towers on the top left corner. Some of you may recognize the three towers, which were called the chain home system. And that was a radar system that Britain had been developing for several years that set up a series of air defenses across the channel that would detect German aircraft, direct fighters, and other anti-aircraft weapons to bring down fighters and bombers. And that was the British view. On the right side, you see this curious pair of wire structures, and they were called the Trilon, that's the tower, and the Perisphere, which looks like a globe. Those were the centerpieces of the New York World's Fair 1939. And my own parents went to the New York World's Fair. I have pictures of when they had been there. And this was a country coming out of the depths of the severe depression, which began in 1929 and 1930, continued until the late 1930s. And the World's Fair was an attempt to show that America was coming back. It was on its feet. Most of the exhibits in the World's Fair were electronic goods, devices for the kitchen, radios, even the new television was being demonstrated. There was nothing in there that talked to war. So here is a British contingent led by on the right-hand side, you see a man with a pinstripe suit. His name is Henry Tizard, and he led a team of British scientists to the United States in the hopes of showing them the scientific developments that Britain had been coming up with for the past, as I said, 10 years, with the hope that the Americans would assist in bringing those new inventions to bear. Now, what Henry Tizard is touching in the middle is something called a cavity magnetron. And you can see that on the bottom left, there's a picture of a manufactured or factory-produced cavity magnetron. The device that Henry Tizard is touching is simply a laboratory demonstrator. And you may have heard of a cavity magnetron, but you've certainly used it. In fact, if you put something into the microwave oven this morning or this afternoon, you use the cavity magnetron because that device in a much smaller form is what powers your microwave oven by producing microwave radiation, which, as it turns out, heats food, but it's also the centerpiece for a new type of radar system. Basically, can take that huge chain home radar system that you see on the top left, which requires very big transmitters, or rather magnetrons, to develop the radio waves, and it shrinks that magnetron down to a size that can fit into an aircraft. So what you're looking at is, in fact, a small version of that chain home, and by putting it on an aircraft, you suddenly change the kinds of capabilities you have in the air. If it's a bomber, the obvious benefit is that it can look down and see targets on the ground at night and through the clouds, and that's what I'll be talking about. It also can look out and detect fighters and other aircraft in the sky. It can be used in anti-submarine warfare to detect submarines on the surface of the ocean, ships as well. So among many other inventions that the Tizard mission brought to the United States, the cavity magnetron was certainly the crown jewel. In fact, that's how it was referred to. One side note, it was during this Tizard mission in 1940 that the British brought the first inklings of what would become the atomic bomb to the Americans. At that time, nobody really believed that a fission bomb was even feasible, but this was the first time that the Americans became aware that there might be a possibility. The reason why airborne radar was so important is that prior to its development, Britain had been working on this pair of systems. One was called G and one was called Oboe. Loran came a little bit later, that used transmitters that were based in Britain to send out radio waves that could be plotted and mapped and detected by bombers and fighters. And by mapping where these hyperbolic grid lines crossed, and that is why it was called G for grid, aircraft could locate themselves fairly accurately out to about 300 miles away from the transmitting stations, which put the range around the western edge of Germany, as well as France, Belgium, etc. So it did give a certain accuracy to the navigation. It could be used for locating targets to drop bombs, not very well. But the biggest problem, as I've just stated, is its range was very limited. So when Britain began its bombing campaign soon after the Battle of Britain, it found itself quite limited to where it could strike Germany. It could strike the Ruhr Valley, it could strike railway stations in France, it could strike certain coastal stations that Germany had occupied, but it couldn't get far into the heart of industrial Germany, or for that matter, any targets in other countries that would have been of strategic importance, for example, oil fields in Romania. So this was a limitation. Now, strategic bombing, from the point of view of both the United States and Britain, was all about getting the best kind of bomb site. Even if you couldn't get your navigation very far out, if you had the right kind of bomb site, you could locate the target and drop it and hit a strategic factory or a railway yard or something else with almost pinpoint accuracy. And that was the goal that the Americans had been working towards ever since the mid 1920s, when a Dutch American inventor named Norden worked on and developed something called the Norden bomb sight. And the Norden bomb sight makes many guest appearances in the television series Masters of the Air. The idea was that with this very finely tuned set of mechanisms, the site could give a bomber at a very high altitude, 20,000 feet or so, the ability to hit a target with a circular error probability. That's the measure that they use for how accurate the sighting was, of about 160 feet, which is about 40 to 50 meters. So that's pretty accurate when you're trying to hit a factory. And this was proved in test after test in the American bombing ranges, which were all in the American West. And if you've been to the American West, it's hot, it's clear, they're generally deserts. So there's very good visibility. And the RAF wanted this bomb site. And they made several requests in the late 1930s. The Americans considered it to be their crown jewel, but it turned out that the British were able to invent a bomb site that was almost as good as the Norden. And here was the real issue, the real problem. As good as the Norden was, and the British bomb site that was its approximate equal, both of them were faced with the problem of European skies at any time of year, especially in the summer, where it's overcast. And so optical bomb sites were almost useless in so many cases. When all of the bombings were averaged, its operational circular error probability was not 160 feet, but 10 times that, closer to 400 meters. So getting anywhere close to a strategic target was going to be as much about luck as it was going to be about accuracy. And of course, there were other problems as well. maneuvering to avoid flak, etc. So it turned out that the Norden bomb sight wasn't any more accurate than what came to replace it, or rather what came to supplement it, which was the radar bombing. So by 1940, the British understood that the Norden bomb sight was not going to be uh, uh, provided to them. And they'd also decided that perhaps this wasn't what they wanted in the first place. By the 1940s, the British had learned that trying to operate in daylight was, was if not suicide, it was risky in the extreme, and the possibility of having much or all of your bombing fleet destroyed, damaged, or otherwise made inoperable was great. So when the the Tizard mission came to the United States in 1940, they wrote a list of what it was that they wanted to learn from about the Americans. And at the very top of the list, the British wanted to know what the Americans knew about radar. It wasn't called radar at the time. The British called it RDF, which didn't mean anything. It was just a set of initials. And they were interested in radio, and they were interested in anti-aircraft guns. But way down at the bottom of the list, you see the Norden sight. So it had dropped in their estimation of something to get from the Americans. In fact, they even misspelled it. And you can see that it comes just above de-icing equipment. So the British understood that the page had turned and they were going to be focusing on developing this new technology, radar. And as soon as the Americans got a hold of this cavity magnetron, they began to test it. And one of the things that happened right away was a new organization was established at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, called the Radiation Lab. And it was called the Radiation Lab as a cover name. It doesn't mean anything. It sounds like you're just investigating X-rays, which was quite common at the time. But what they were actually doing was developing all of the technologies that surrounded radar, not just airborne radar, but also radar for ground-based fire control, and radar for landing aids, and radar for ships, and so on and so forth. In addition to establishing this new laboratory at MIT, and there were other laboratories as well, they also set up a manufacturing line that could produce these cavity magnetrons. Something like 100,000 of them were built during the war, mostly by the same women who, up until that point, had been building telephones for the American consumers. You see, it was Western Electric, that's the name of the factory, that built telephones for the Bell Telephone Company. That was the big telephone provider, the only telephone provider in the United States at the time. So they were mass producing these cavity magnetrons for the United States, for Britain, and pretty much any other allied nation that was in the war, but it's still pretty much Britain and the United States, Australia a little bit, etc. But the important task was to take these cavity magnetrons and the radars that came with them and get them out into the front lines as quickly as possible. In order to do that, the Americans established what was called the OSRD London mission and the BBRL in Britain. Let me explain what these initials mean. The United States had understood that it had to mobilize its scientists for the war that was coming in as early as 1940. Even though the United States was neutral, many scientists, many engineers knew that war would eventually come to the shores, and science would have to play a major part because the adversary, Germany, had some of the finest scientists and engineers on the planet. And so the United States created what was called the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD, which did not belong to the Navy, did not belong to the Army, but rather produced technologies, inventions, carried out experiments, carried out manufacturing that could create all of these new technologies and get them to the Army, the Navy, and the Army Air Force, and to the Allies very quickly. So they had almost carte blanche. Roosevelt essentially said, you report directly to me, and they didn't have to worry about going through military channels. So OSRD set up an office in London that would coordinate the inventions and cooperation of technology development and fielding between the United States and Britain. And it was a small office, and you can see that people were just literally sitting on top of each other's desks, trying to get all the work done. And they coordinated hundreds and hundreds of scientists and engineers and tens of thousands of messages and communications that went back and forth between the United States and Britain during the war. And some of the things they were doing were developing these radar systems, and they were doing it in real time, where the Americans and British both had laboratories and workshops. And that brings me to BBRL, the British branch of the Radiation Laboratory. Now, I've already mentioned that RAD Lab, Radiation Laboratory, was the MIT laboratory creating these airborne radars and others. And in order to get that capability nearer to the front line, MIT established a laboratory physically next to, in fact, on the same grounds as Britain's Telecommunications Research Establishment, TRE. So you had a hut for the Americans, a hut for the British. Each of them are working on the similar problems. They're working in each other's workshops. They're sharing tools. They're sharing knowledge. They're physically working side by side to get these radars and other equipment out to the front lines. And one of the most important pieces of equipment that you see is slung below these two B-17s, their later model, and they're flying with what was called the H-2X radar. And the H-2X was a more advanced radar that had a shorter wavelength, which means that it was more accurate. It could discern smaller targets. It could see through clouds better. And you can see that those radar domes replaced the belly turret, the Sperry ball turret. And I'm sure that a lot of ball turret machine gunners did not complain too much. That was probably the most dangerous place on the aircraft. And the radar became an integral part of how the war was fought. Harry Crosby is featured in the television series Masters of the Air. He appears in the book, not as much, but I took a few lines from his own memoirs, which were called A Wing and a Prayer, to describe how the radar and the navigator work together. So if you have not seen Masters of the Air, or if you haven't read the book yet, Harry Crosby is featured as a navigator novice. He does quite well during one of the missions. He was able to get the bombers home through some pretty difficult times. He's eventually promoted to group navigator, and he becomes something of a star within the 100th Bomber Group, and he's featured in this series. That's the real person at the top left. That's obviously him as portrayed in Masters of the Air. And then on the right-hand side, you see a radar station, radar kit, and then the bombers sorry, the navigator station. And I don't need to read these to you, but the important thing to note is that the navigator and the radar operator worked hand in hand. It wasn't simply a matter of using the radar to tell you where you were and then drop on the radar image. The navigator had to plot where the plane and the squadron were. He used the radar to help identify targets where he couldn't see them. And even if the bombardier couldn't see the target, as you can see in the second paragraph, with his Norden bomb sight, they had a good enough idea from the radar images to know where they were, where the drop site should be, and so they could do some damage, maybe not as much as they had initially hoped, but rather than flying back with a load of bombs and not using it, they were able to bomb the surrounding areas and do some real damage. And you can see that Crosby credits the radar. Now he uses the phrase blind bombing. The Americans and the British did not like that phrase, or rather the Americans didn't like that phrase. It sounded like bombs were being dropped without regard to who and what was underneath. It sounded almost capricciosa. It sounded capricious. So they use the term bombing through overcast. It sounds much more sanitary. Of course it wasn't. And of course, both the Americans and the British dropped bombs on civilian targets and strategic targets alike. The RAF continued to use its bombers at night, where they weren't subjected to the same degree of attacks by fighters as during the daytime. There was also less opportunity to be hit by anti-aircraft weapons, although they still were being hit. The Germans had radar as well, and they used it. But the airborne. Yes, I heard a. No, I'll continue. And are we coming to the end of the hour? Regarded as an American fighter, it was in fact ordered by the British, who came to the United States in 1940, asking to build P-40 fighters. This man, Edgar Schmuid, told them from North American Aviation that he could build a better fighter, and he could do it in 100 days, and he did. So the P-51 was ordered by the British, built to British specifications. In fact, one of the engineers who had worked on the Spitfire, a man named Beverly Shenstone, helped with the aerodynamics of the P-51. It was put into service with the RAF initially, and that's why it's often called a British-bred, American-born fighter. And then when it arrived in Britain in 1942 or 1941 and went into service, they initially put it as a low-level fighter, which is what the Spitfire was, just to carry out defensive missions. But by the time the Mustang had arrived, Britain's tactics had changed, its strategy had changed. They were going to conduct long-range bombing missions. They needed a high-altitude escort. And the Mustang's engine, which was a General Motors Allison engine, was simply not powerful enough to bring the Mustang up to the altitude and the speed that it needed. But the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine could do that. Now, the good news was that separately, Britain had already been working with the United States to build its Rolls-Royce Merlin engines in American factories. I've already mentioned that factories in Britain were being bombed. the British Rolls-Royce company packed up a complete engine and the plans, and as the evacuation of Dunkirk was happening, and sent them aboard this battleship, HMS Revenge, which was carrying gold bullion for safekeeping from Britain. And when the plans and the engine arrived, it went to the Packard Motor Company in Detroit, which took one look at the engine, realized that there was no possible way to build the engine on American factory lines because it really wasn't designed for mass production. They redesigned the entire Merlin engine and began building them, mostly for British use on bombers, on Canadian and British patrol boats. But as it happened, the fighters and Spitfires and other fighters, but as it happened, the Merlin engine fit very nicely into the Mustang airframe, and it was a test flight with the airframe and a Merlin engine that convinced this man on the top left, Colonel Tommy Hitchcock, or Lieutenant Colonel Tommy Hitchcock, to fit the Mustang with the Merlin engine. And he made sure that would happen by talking to one of his family friends, Franklin Roosevelt. And so Franklin Roosevelt gets word of this from Hitchcock. He sends a note to the Army Air Force saying, I hear that the British really like their Merlin engines and that it could work well on the Mustang. What do you know about it? And the Army Air Force knew an order when it heard one. And so it immediately started building Mustangs with the Merlin engines. And then when they were fitted with drop tanks, they gave the fighter the range necessary to escort bombers deep into Germany. And in fact, the Merlin Mustang was the preferred fighter of the famous Tuskegee Airmen Red Tails, who are going to be making an appearance in Masters of the Air at some point. They haven't appeared yet. Now, often the credit to long-range bombing is given to the P-51 Mustang, but I need to again point out that when bombers were simply flying with navigational aids of G and oboe, their range to be able to get accurately to the target accurately was limited to about 300 miles. That only brought them to places like Bremen and Frankfurt and some of the bases in the Netherlands, France, Belgium. Only with that combination of airborne radar and the Mustang as the escort could bombers bring the fight all the way to Berlin and further. And here are some examples of a Mustang escorting both the British and the American bombers. And the question is again raised time and again, did strategic bombing matter? And I think the answer, despite discussions that point out that the German economy was able to come back from much of the damage, the evidence points to the great contribution of strategic bombing to stopping the German war effort. And that's taken from several quotes. Albert Speer, of course, was the minister in charge of production. And in his interviews, he said that bombing caused the breakdown of the German armaments industry. Hermann Goering, the aviation minister, said precision bombing was responsible for destroying a lot of the industry, and that it was the long-range fighters that were clearly made that that possible. And then finally, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Report speaks to the fact that the bombing campaign did result in an almost full collapse of the industry, but it was not possible to say that it was the definitive cause, because by the time the bombing campaigns had reached their crescendo, the Allied troops were already breaching the German frontier and making their inroads. I just want to end by pointing out that all of this was happening during a time of enormous upheaval in both the war as well as in the industries and in the scientific community. Vannevar Bush, who was in charge of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, pointed out after the war that World War II was the first war in human history to be affected decisively by weapons unknown at the outbreak of hostilities. And the atomic bomb is one example, but here I've just given you a very brief summation of two other inventions, airborne radar and the long-range P-51 escort fighter, that had not been thought of when war broke out, and through the cooperative effort of these two allied nations were brought into action and helped to end the war. And because time is limited, I will now open the floor for questions.
Thank you so much, Larry, and thank you for helping us with this presentation. We are loving it.
Now,
and though the time is limited for now, we are very confident that we should continue that to do in the future something like that. Maybe another issue, maybe another theme. Who knows? I understand you know so much about history, so we'll ask you some more questions.
I think the important thing to notice here is that in the year 2024, we're still having technical problems, and you can imagine how they were overcoming technical problems in 1944. 80 years ago in real time while they were being shot at. So I think that's a head nod to...
It's difficult to understand, but again, we're here for that. At least we have a tiny idea of the reality those times. So I'll start, thank you, and then move along to the questions. We never know when the connection may fall off. So thank you for making this for us, these talks that you have to choose, understand a little bit of a few details and choose rather difficulty with some level of difficulty, the number of innovations that you might understand were the good ones or the ones that actually were the most important. But I'll ask you, Larry, if you had to grade those, what are the top three for you?
At the top of the list is penicillin, hands down, and for a very obvious reason. Its utility during the war was important. It certainly cut down the mortality rate of soldiers, of civilians who were wounded. But penicillin, which I talk about quite a bit in my book, launched a revolution in medicine and biology. Prior to the development of antibiotics, infections could take large percentages of people who might have survived an injury or a disease only to succumb to other problems. And this was true in any circumstance, from getting a cut on a infected knife to childbirth. So one of the things I often think about when I'm asked, what era would you prefer to live in the past? My answer is, in no era where there was not widely available antibiotics. It completely changed the mortality rate of humankind, and also led to the advancements that we now see in genetics and microbiology, etc. So that I would put as number one. Number two, I'm going to say the microwave radar, not just because I happen to have heated up some of some of my lunch this afternoon. Microwave radar launched what we call in the United States Silicon Valley. Most of you have heard of it. The boom in electronics, which then led to this incredible boom in software, which is now an integral part of our day-to-day lives. And that's not just true for developed countries. That's true for people and nations around the world, can be traced to that initial development. I'll give some thought to the third one, but I'm going to put those, for the time being, as far as making a global contribution to humankind. I'm going to put those two at the top of the list, and I'll see if I can think of what a third one would be. Most of the other ones are directly related to the war effort, and as such, didn't always have as big an impact once the war ended.
Let me take me to airplanes, and one of the ones you talked about is the P-51, regardless one of the best looking airplanes around. And I know you have something for us. What can you tell me more about P-51 that you haven't told us so far?
Sure. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. I saved this for the end. One of the questions was this famous P-51 Mustang. Is it, in fact, visible, or can we see it here in Europe? And so I went to Wikipedia, which is where I go even as an historian to get my first glimpse, and I put it on this map. So 15,000 Mustangs were built during the war. Only 1% of them survive, about 150. And of those 150, there's about 30 here in Europe. And you can see where they're located. Most of them, of course, are in Britain because Britain was flying the Mustangs as part of their Royal Air Force. Nothing on the Iberian Peninsula that I found. The closest ones that I've seen from this Wikipedia article are in Italy, France, Switzerland, and then smattering in a few other countries. So if you want to go visit, my advice is fly north for a couple of hours, go to the various RAF museums. But if you want to come to the United States and see Mustangs, I can point out a couple of places to go. First, of course, is to visit Tom Cruise and his Mustang, which he bought. There it is, featured in Top Gun Maverick. And I'm sure every one of you asked the same question that I did. How does a Navy captain on flight pay afford a Mustang, which last time I checked, a Mustang in good condition can fetch anywhere between 5 million and 10 million euros? And the answer is movie magic. But Tom Cruise can't afford it. If you want to visit a P-51 and be certain of seeing it, then please go to my home, Long Island, New York, and there in Farmingdale, where I used to work, is the Air Power Museum. And there in one of the hangars is this particular Mustang, which was used for stunt flying for some time. And it's in excellent condition. I don't think that this one is flyable anymore. There are Mustangs that are flown in air shows, but definitely take a trip to Farmingdale, New York. And if you do go, I can tell you where to get the best deli sandwiches, the best American pizza. Notice I said American pizza. It's not the same thing as pizza anywhere else. And just drop me a line and I'll tell you all the places. And finally, if you want to see a B-17 flying, they do fly around in the United States. And here I was able to see one of them come to the Washington, D.C. area a few years ago to an airport near to where I live now. And that's the B-17, which you can pay, I don't know how many thousands of dollars is a flight, to go up and take a flight. But it's still a beautiful airplane after all these years. They keep them flying. I understand that they only used a few for occasional shots during Masters of the Air, and they built a few full-size replicas for the ground shots. So that's what I have to say about these two aircraft.
Thank you so much, Larry. It was so much fun. And I think when the TV series ends in Apple TV, Masters of the Air, we might have the chance to maybe have a talk about the roundabout, about all that series portrayed the history of one of the bomb group and all of the World War II bomber squad. So I think we'll have a chance to maybe meet again and talk about all that and all these the history details.
Well, I'd be very interested to hear, especially what experts have to say about that. So I'm looking forward.
We'll try to get something that someone on that table, even though the table might be virtual. Thank you so much for staying with us. Thank you so much for helping Vintage Aero Club to foster and promote the history of aviation. We was so much fun to have you here in Portugal last year. We'll talk about some other parts, but we hope to have you back someday.
It was my pleasure, and I look forward to the return. Have a very good evening, all.
Thank you so much once again. Thank you.
Bye.